On a long enough timeline, the chance that any given video game YouTube channel will talk about Sonic the Hedgehog approaches 100%. We're getting ours out of the way early. There's something that's always bothered me about Knuckles as a character. Something happened to him after the Genesis era, and his character fundamentally changed from what it was, and I think there's a lot we can learn from what that change means in the broader context of storytelling. Understanding how characters can change so drastically is good for honing our craft as writers, because stories matter. Today, I'd like to talk to you about character archetypes. The Sonic franchise has an insane roster of wacky characters, what with your charmy bees and your Honey the Cats, but I remember back in the good old days when it was a hedgehog, a fox, an echidna, and a mad scientist trying to take over the world. Some of my earliest gaming memories are of me and my brother blazing through those games together. Knuckles was always my favorite of the OG Sonic crew. After his first appearance in Sonic 3 and Knuckles though, his character has kind of been all over the place. Depending on what version of Sonic we're talking about, he's either a goofball idiot, an impulsive powerhouse, or, most commonly, a proud stoic warrior with a serious case of naivete. The thing is, those characterizations are mostly wrong. Knuckles isn't supposed to be any of those things, and I can prove it. And I don't just mean that Knuckles isn't supposed to be dumb, which, let's be clear, he isn't. I mean that Knuckles isn't supposed to be a proud stoic warrior. I don't even think he's supposed to be a great warrior at all. The Knuckles we see now isn't the Knuckles we were promised in those first games, and I think I know why that change happened. But to talk about that, first we've got to cover one of my favorite topics in narrative theory: character archetypes. In the simplest terms, a character archetype is a type of character that shares common traits across lots of different stories. Think of them as specific roles or jobs that a character fulfills in the story. They're a foundational part of how a character interacts with the plot and the setting. It's one of the oldest ideas in fiction. In fact, it's one of the oldest ideas in the history of ideas. They can trace their legacy back into ancient history, and modern literary archetypes owe a lot to the Greek philosopher Plato. If you're asking yourself whether I'm seriously about to make a connection between the Greek philosopher Plato and Knuckles the Echidna, yes I am. Strap in folks, it's gonna be a ride. One of the ideas Plato is most well known for is the Platonic ideal form. He thought that everything in reality was an imperfect shadow of some perfect version of itself. The perfect version, or form, transcended time and space and was the template for everything like it in the universe. According to the theory of forms, somewhere in the ether there exists a cup that is the most cuppy cup to ever cup. The perfect cup. Every other cup in the universe is just an imperfect riff on that ideal cup, a pale imitation of cuppy perfection. Character archetypes work in the same way. A character archetype is the Platonic form of a character, the most basic and fundamental version of what a character is. For example, one of the most common archetypes you'll see is the mentor. They're the teacher, the guide, the person who's already experienced the world and passes that knowledge and skill down to the hero because they can't be the hero themselves. Maybe they're too old, or maybe they're too jaded, or maybe their own story is already done and it's time to pass the torch. The mentor's role in the story is to teach the hero what they need to know to be the hero, and fiction is absolutely lousy with them. You've got your Gandalfs, your Obi-Wans, your Eda the Owl Ladies. Hell, you can't throw a rock without hitting somebody who will teach you all about rock lore. Mentor characters can and do have different personalities, goals, and values, and I would pay really good money to see Eda the Owl Lady and Gandalf in a room together. But they all serve the same function in the story, to teach the hero how to be a hero. That's an archetype. Lots of people way smarter than me have analyzed archetypes and how they apply to life. Psychologist Carl Jung built a huge part of his career out of psychological archetypes by identifying common symbols and themes across different cultures, which he called Jungian archetypes. He thought that some symbols were a part of what he called the collective unconscious, a shared set of instincts and ideas common to all people. While Jung's work on the topic is a little too close to mysticism for my liking, they're a good example of how some ideas seem to be inherent to our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. Of course, anyone who knows me knows that everything eventually winds up at Joseph Campbell, the guy responsible for establishing the structure of 95% of your favorite stories. In his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Campbell distilled a lot of the ideas floating around about this into 8 common fictional archetypes. Let's be real here. Campbell, I love you, buddy, but you have got to make it less obvious when you copy Young's homework. You really just took that ball and ran with it, huh? While Campbell's list of archetypes is far from exhaustive, and better literary theorists have expanded and refined on those ideas, they make for a good starting point for understanding how characters work in a story. It's really hard to have a story without archetypes. In fact, if there is a way to have a story without archetypes, I definitely don't know about it. If you do, please leave a comment. So, what do all these big thinky boys and their big brain ideas have to do with Sonic the Hedgehog? Well, a lot, actually. The story of the first two Sonic games is pretty bare bones. They come from an era when most stories had to be printed in the game manuals, so it didn't take away any precious cartridge space from things like Sega! What we do get is pretty simple. A mad scientist is trying to conquer the world and turn all of the plants and animals into robots. You are a hedgehog who runs fast. Oh, and here's a fox this time. But even with that basic setup, we still get a few archetypes. There are a lot of archetypes that aren't there, but that's okay. Not all stories need every kind of archetype, and this one is a pretty basic story that doesn't need a lot going for it. For example, we don't see any mentors, at least not in the framing that we have. More on that later. Foreshadowing. But the archetypes that are there are pretty dang solid. Sonic and Tails slot pretty neatly into the hero and ally archetype. Sonic is the main character. He's the one who directly opposes Dr. Robotnik. He's the one going through the major obstacles, busting up the bad guys, and gotta going fast. When Robotnik is up to trouble, you can bet Sonic is gonna be the one to show up and take him down. Meanwhile, Tails is a classic ally, always there to help Sonic succeed and do his thing. He flies Sonic around, He's the quintessential player too, the choice of little brothers everywhere. He's there to help the hero do his thing. Tails has had a few cute character arcs about learning to come into his own outside of the hero's shadow. No, not that one. Which is a common character arc for an ally archetype. Say what you will about the Sonic franchise, but these two are really good examples of their intended archetypes. Simple, clear-cut, and easy. So what about Knuckles? Starting from about Sonic Adventure onwards, Knuckles fits all of the traits of a proud warrior archetype. He's stoic, hot-headed, thinks with his fists first and his brain a distant last, and takes his duty to protect the Master Emerald as super serious business. He's the last of his people, a race of proud warriors, and is responsible for carrying the weight of their legacy on his shoulders. As the games progress, he becomes more and more of a meathead, but he always retains that warrior spirit. When he has a problem, he'll come at it head-on and swinging, ready to throw down. The Sonic 2 movie takes this to the extreme, making him the only real straight man character to everyone else's zany shenanigans. He doesn't have time for your shenanigans, Sonic. He's incapable of a single shenanigan. He famously doesn't chuckle. I don't chuckle. But I don't think that's what he was supposed to be. Let's look at what he does in his first game, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Right off the bat, the first thing he does is surprise Sonic, steals his emeralds, and oh my god, he's chuckling. Later in that same level, he throws a switch and sends Sonic and Tails plummeting into the island's sewer? Reservoir? I don't know, it's not really clear what this level is supposed to be. He keeps this up all through the game, waiting for you to stumble into his next trap and throwing a switch to send you off into peril. He sneaks around, harasses you, and hinders your progress with underhanded tactics at every turn. To me, this doesn't read as a proud, noble warrior. The Knuckles we get in later games would be waiting on the beach with a glare before smashing the plane apart with a single mighty punch and challenging Sonic to good old fisticuffs.
Were that wretch of noble rank, I would challenge him to combat mortal.
What we actually see are straight-up guerrilla tactics, and he is loving it. In fact, he only directly confronts you twice in the whole game. First, he's waiting at the launch base zone, where he gives your floating eggmobile thing a little bap. Look at that. It's so cute. Bap. Look at him go. I love it. Bap. While that's definitely a feat of strength, based on what we've already seen of him, I'd be willing to bet he's about to pull off some more mischief here. But the rocket lifts off, he falls down, and he is out of here. Not exactly the stuff of legends. The second and last time is the iconic showdown in the Master Emerald Chamber, where he finally squares up and starts swinging. Everything has built up to this confrontation. The last guardian of Angel Island versus the Blue Blur, a clash of titans that will ring out through the ages. He goes down like a little bitch.
Whoopsies!
This fight is fascinating. It's easy to think of this as an epic duel between the hero and a mighty warrior, but that's not actually what it is when you really look at it. Knuckles has spent the whole story trying to prevent you from being here. Robotnik has convinced him that Sonic is here for the Master Emerald, and now here he is in the most sacred chamber of the island. Knuckles has failed. All his tricks, all his traps, everything he's done to keep us from getting here has been for nothing. He's the last guardian, and he couldn't stop the enemy from reaching the emerald. This isn't a proud warrior's last stand. This is a guy who's in over his head, backed into a corner. He's got nothing left. No more secret passages, no more switches, no more boulders to throw at us, no more sewers to throw us in. The only remaining option is to fight head on, and he doesn't stand a chance. He's by far the easiest fight in the whole game, and maybe even the easiest fight in the whole classic series. Knuckles has the chance to prove himself as a mighty warrior, and when he finally steps up, he comes up way short, which actually makes a lot of sense. By now, Sonic is old hat at taking down an overwhelming force invading his lands, but how many times has Knuckles ever had to deal with that? I can hear some of you now. But Nathan, you handsome devil, why is your beard so glorious? And what about Knuckles taking down all of Robotnik's baddies in his own campaign? Aw shucks, regular brushing and beard oils, thanks for noticing. Knuckles does kick every available ass when you're playing as him, but I think there's a bit of nuance behind that. When we start his playthrough, he's chilling out, having a little nap, when BAM! Surprise bomb! He goes on a Kill Bill-style roaring rampage of revenge and ultimately saves the island through the power of incredible violence. Doesn't that prove that he's the mighty warrior we all know and love? Well, not exactly. This is when we start getting into the weeds of gaming as a storytelling medium, because it can get weird. The relationship between game and story is sometimes pretty complicated. We've all seen it. When you're in control of the action, you dominate. You beat that boss with style, you breeze through every challenge the devs throw at you, and then your character gets absolutely bodied in a cutscene. Sometimes the story and gameplay don't gel well with each other. There's a fancy term for that, and it's ludonarrative dissonance. And yes, I am absolutely talking about ludonarrative dissonance in a video about Sonic the Hedgehog. We have to remember that these were made as games first, and the story is mostly a loose framework to have fun doing loop-de-loops and all that sweet, sweet blast processing. I mean, Tails does the same thing in his solo campaign, and he can beat up Knuckles too. That doesn't make him a warrior archetype. Hell, in his campaign in Sonic Adventure, he beats Sonic in every race. That doesn't mean he's canonically faster than him. There has to be some concession for player agency here. Every time we see Knuckles when he's not under the player's control, he's a total wimp. If they wanted to make the story and the gameplay mesh better, I think it would have been a lot stronger as a narrative if we got to play Knuckles the way we see him in the main game. It would have been so cool to have him use secret passages and traps and whatnot, instead of just making him a red Sonic that can glide. I mean, I understand why they did it the way they did. Adding a new gameplay style would have been too much for what they were working with. If you know anything about the development cycle of that game, you know it was already pretty rough.
Rougher than the rest of them.
What about the manuals? That's where the story lives in these old games. They give us some info on our little red buddy, but nothing that paints him as the proud warrior he would be later. Sonic 3's manual says that he's clever and athletic, he uses secret passages, and he's the last guardian of the Emerald. There's nothing about his combat prowess, and there's no real context for what being the last guardian means, or even if he was tasked with it or chose it himself. The Sonic & Knuckles manual has a promising little nugget when it says that his mission is to wage war on all invaders. Now that's more like it. But it also doesn't give any context and still doesn't tell us about his personality or how he wages that war. It's tempting to say that the phrasing of waging war makes him a warrior archetype, but I don't think that's enough. Being the last guardian is his backstory, not necessarily his archetype. So what do we actually have here? We know Knuckles is clever, and he uses that cleverness to impede Sonic indirectly, only ever confronting him head on when he has no more choice. Every time he pulls some mischief, he looks like he's having the time of his life. When he's not under player control, he's a pretty lousy warrior. When we do see him off the clock, he's just lazing around and vibing on his paradise island. None of this paints him as a mighty stoic warrior. I know that's where he eventually ends up, but I just don't see it here. So if he's not a warrior archetype, what is he? At first, I thought he might be a classic Guardian at the Gate. Last Guardian, Guardian at the Gate, there's gotta be something there, right? The Guardian at the Gate is an obstacle that tries to prevent the hero from moving from one act of the story to another. That's not really my man Knuckles here. While he does try to stop Sonic, he's usually the one launching us into the next level, and he sticks around for the whole story. Funny enough, the mini-bosses are literal guardians trying to keep you from moving from Act 1 to Act 2, so that's pretty neato. What about the archetypical Shadow? No, not that one. The Shadow is the dark reflection of everything the hero is, their antithesis and opposite. They are a mockery of everything that makes the hero noble, and they usually embody the parts of the hero's personality that the hero represses. The two best examples that I know are Mr. Hyde and Professor Moriarty. Hyde is literally Dr. Jekyll without any of his inhibitions, and Moriarty is an example of what happens when somebody with Sherlock Holmes's brilliant mind uses his talents for crime. Closer, but still not quite Knuckles. Nothing about him is Sonic's opposite, unless we're counting color palettes. No, Knuckles fits more neatly into a different archetype. I think Knuckles is a trickster. Tricksters are super interesting in fiction, and take on a lot of roles in the stories they inhabit. They can be a lot more fluid than other archetypes, and I personally find the term trickster to be a little too restrictive as a description. You probably know more than a few. Loki is the classic trickster of Norse mythology, Bugs Bunny is constantly up to some zany shenanigans, and Deadpool has been the idol of the most annoying people you know since 2016. There's a variety there that makes them harder to pin down than other archetypes, which I think is pretty on brand. So there are these two really smart literary analysts, named William Hines and William Doty, or the Double Bills as I like to call them. These mad lads wrote a paper together that identified some of the traits that most tricksters have at least a few of. While their work is far from comprehensive, it's an impressive analysis, and I recommend you read it if you're at all interested in character archetypes and folklore. I wonder how Knuckles stacks up. Let's find out. First, tricksters are fundamentally ambiguous or anomalous, which is a fancy way of saying they don't fit into the moral or cultural framework of the world. That doesn't really describe Knuckles. Tricksters are deceivers and trick players, which fits Knuckles to a T. Tricksters are often shapeshifters or masters of disguise. Sorry Knuckles, no dice. They're inverters of situations, which Knuckles does a lot of through the game. It's kinda his whole deal. Tricksters are messengers and imitators of the gods. Knuckles fits this one too. He does represent the last remnants of a cosmic power, which is about as close to that as we get in these games. We're gonna give that one a soft yes, but I'll admit that that one is a bit of a weaker connection than the others. Finally, the trickster engages in sacred and lewd bricoleur, which is a word I didn't know until I researched this video. This one means that the trickster can take the sacred and make it lewd, or vice versa, which Knuckles doesn't do. Of the Double Bill's 6 traits of a trickster, Knuckles hits 3. That's a win in my book. But the trickster goes far beyond these 6 traits. Nailing down a trickster is harder than other archetypes, specifically because a trickster is designed to be all over the place. In a lot of ways, tricksters can be more vibes-based than other characters. Even without hitting 3 of the 6 traits, I'd still feel confident in counting Knuckles as a trickster. He mocks you, plays pranks on you, and frustrates you at every turn. This guy is a goofy little trickster, not a proud stoic fighter. So what happened? How did Knuckles get from a chuckling wimp to tougher than leather? It all started with Sonic Adventure, which reframed a lot of things in Sonic canon and started our little red goofball down a road that he's still on today. This Knuckles is a proud, lonely warrior burdened by his role as the last guardian. Here, he muses about his fate and feels shackled to his mission. He's also a bit of a dummy, which is a character trait that he never had before and still shows up in modern appearances. The writer for Sonic Adventure was Akinori Nishiyama, who has a prolific career in writing for the series. He even wrote the story for the first 2 Genesis games. But, and here's the key to all of these changes, the only classic games he didn't write for are Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Nishiyama fundamentally changed Knuckles' character, turning him from a clever trickster to a stoic fighter who jumps to conclusions and gets easily manipulated by everyone with 2 brain cells. It's no coincidence that the shift in his character came from a writer who didn't work on his debut games. This comes to its natural conclusion in the Sonic 2 movie, where Knuckles is the most badass warrior he's ever been. He's come a long way from where he started. The trickster is out, the warrior is in. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sonic is the hero archetype, but he also embodies some elements of the trickster himself. He takes almost nothing seriously and revels in thwarting Robotnik's plans with comedic style. Having 2 tricksters on the squad can get crowded, but having a trickster hero, an ally, and a proud warrior makes for a great group dynamic. Sonic can do the chuckling for both of them, thank you very much. Making Knuckles his rival works, but Sonic gets a much more thematically appropriate one in Shadow, who is his literal Jungian Shadow archetype. Moving Knuckles to a new archetype works a lot better in the new direction for the characters from Adventure onward, and I think where they landed is perfectly fine. The thing is, archetypes are a great guide, but they don't have to be super rigid. There's a phenomenon in writing for archetypes that I see all over the place in fiction, including in the Sonic games and especially in Sonic Adventure. Knuckles is a trickster or a warrior, sure, but only when we're framing the narrative on Sonic. That framing is important because when you shift the framing, the archetypes the characters inhabit also shift. In Sonic's campaign, he's the hero, Tails is the ally, and so on. But when you play as Tails, he becomes the hero in his own arc, and Sonic becomes the mentor archetype. Knuckles is the hero in his own campaign, with Sonic as the ally and Tails as there, I guess. Shadow is Sonic's, shadow, but in the Dark campaign, he's got his own heroic journey to fulfill what he thinks his promise to Maria was. In that framing, Sonic is ironically Shadow's shadow. You've heard the phrase that everyone is the hero of their own story, but when you actually apply that to a work of fiction, it tends to shift around what roles every character plays. Archetypes are fluid and completely dependent on who the story is framed around. I call this phenomenon the dynamic archetype. Going back to the Genesis games, if you frame the story around Knuckles, he becomes the trickster hero defending his island from the invading force of Sonic, his shadow, under the guidance of his mentor, Robotnik. A good writer can play with which character fulfills which archetype in relation to one another, and a great writer understands that archetypes are fluid guidelines, not just stock roles in a story. I miss the trickster Knuckles. I like him as a stoic warrior, sure, but my favorite version of him will always be the goofy little trickster of Angel Island. Who knows, maybe one day we'll see him get back to his trickster roots. Either way, he represents how characters and their archetypes can evolve, and how that's not always a bad thing. There is one hill I will die on, though. Let Knuckles chuckle, you cowards! Hey, thanks for watching. It really means a lot that you stuck around to the end. If you like what we do, join the Beam Battalion by hitting that subscribe button and ringing the bell. It really helps us out a lot. If you really like what we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon. All of our links are in the video description. A very special thank you to our wonderful Patreon supporters. Come check us out on Twitch if you want to discuss stories in gaming with us. If you like the art and theme music, check out Lovecraft Media. And if you like what you're hearing now, go check out Lunatic High. Those guys are amazing. Remember, we love you all, and there's nothing you can do about it.